December 22nd, 1944. The time was 1447 hours. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, alongside other members of his staff, stood with the Führer, examining a map in his command post at La Glaise, a smug smile playing on his lips. His 6th SS Panzer Army had punched a hole 60 kilometers deep into the American lines. Before him lay reports detailing the utter chaos and panic amongst the enemy ranks. Entire divisions were said to be retreating in complete disarray. "Americans aren't soldiers," he boasted to his chief of staff, his voice dripping with contempt. "They're just merchants playing at war. When it comes to a real fight, they simply run." Some 800 kilometers to the south, in the town of Nancy, General George Patton was studying the very same map. However, his face was not etched with arrogance, but with a cold, simmering fury. His Third Army was gearing up for what would become one of the most audacious maneuvers in modern military history. "In 48 hours, Patton thundered to his commanders, his voice cutting through the room like a sharpened blade. "We will pivot this entire army 90 degrees and deliver a blow to those Germans that they will never forget." 4 days later, Dietrich's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of grim realization. His supposedly invincible SS army was surrounded, and the Americans, the very soldiers he had so thoroughly despised, were rewriting the rules of blitzkrieg. This is the story of how arrogance turned into a living nightmare, and how Hitler's most desperate gamble became Patton's greatest, most celebrated triumph. On December 16, 1944, at precisely 5:30 hours, the serene silence of the Ardennes forest was abruptly and violently torn apart by the earth-shattering roar of 1,000 artillery pieces. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's final, desperate bid to alter the course of the war, had begun in earnest. A staggering force of 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 600 tanks and 1,900 guns, crashed into an 80-kilometer front defended by a mere 4 American divisions. It was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the spring of 1940. Hitler had chosen for his last, all-or-nothing strike the very same location where, 4 years prior, his armies had blazed a trail to the English Channel, crushing the French forces in their path. The Ardennes, with its difficult terrain, dense forests, and winding, narrow roads, seemed like the perfect place for a surprise assault, a swift and decisive blow. The American command, lulled into a false sense of security, considered this sector quiet and strategically unimportant, and consequently stationed its least experienced units there. The 106th Infantry Division had only arrived at the front lines a mere 2 weeks earlier. The 28th Infantry Division was still recovering from the brutal fighting they had endured in the Hürtgen forest. In the initial hours of the offensive, everything seemed to be going according to the German plan. American units, caught completely off guard and woefully unprepared, retreated in a state of near panic. Entire battalions surrendered without putting up much of a fight. On the first day alone, the Germans advanced a stunning 20 kilometers. In Berlin, a wave of euphoria swept through the ranks of the Nazi leadership. Goebbels, the master of propaganda, began preparing a proclamation celebrating a second Dunkirk, a devastating defeat for the Allies. Wehrmacht generals, who had been forced into a long and agonizing retreat for months, suddenly dared to believe that victory was once again within their grasp. But in the Allied headquarters at Versailles, the atmosphere was decidedly different. General Eisenhower, a seasoned and astute commander, realized that the Germans were betting absolutely everything they had left on this one desperate roll of the dice. This was not merely a tactical diversion or a feint. It was a high-stakes strategic gamble that could either prolong the war by another year of bloodshed or bring it to a swift and definitive end. And so, Eisenhower made the boldest decision of his distinguished career. He immediately picked up the phone and called Patton. The audacious plan for Operation Wacht am Rhein had been conceived in the German High Command during the fall of 1944. Driven by desperation and fueled by unrealistic hopes, Hitler, trapped between the relentless advance of the Red Army in the east and the overwhelming might of the Allied forces in the west, desperately sought a way to dramatically shift the balance of power in his favor. On September 16, 1944, the Führer summoned Colonel General Alfred Jodl and unveiled a plan so audacious, so wildly ambitious, that it shocked even this battle-hardened staff officer. German forces were to break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and effectively split the Allied armies right down the middle. "If we succeed in taking Antwerp," Hitler declared, tracing his finger across the map with an almost manic intensity, "the British and Americans will be cut off from each other. They'll be forced to negotiate a separate peace with us. And then we can throw everything we have against the Bolsheviks and crush them once and for all." The plan looked impressive on paper, a grand and sweeping strategy that could potentially snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. 3 powerful armies, the 5th and 6th SS Panzer Armies, along with the 7th Army, were to cover a distance of 150 kilometers and seize Antwerp in a mere 4 days. To achieve this seemingly impossible objective, Hitler was willing to commit the Reich's last strategic reserves, a formidable force of 12 panzer divisions, including the most elite and battle-hardened SS units. However, Jodl and other experienced generals immediately saw the glaring problems and inherent flaws in Hitler's grand design. The Germans were critically short on fuel. Each panzer division had only enough ammunition and supplies for a mere 150 kilometers of travel. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force in the skies, could field at most 800 aircraft against the Allies' overwhelming air superiority of 4,000 planes. And, most importantly, the Americans were no longer the inexperienced and poorly equipped novices who had suffered a humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass in 1943. They had learned, adapted, and grown into a formidable fighting force. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the nominal commander of the Western Front, dismissed the entire operation as a grandiose fantasy, a pipe dream detached from the harsh realities of the battlefield. Field Marshal Walter Model, who was tasked with directly commanding the offensive, pleaded with Hitler to scale it down, to make it more realistic and achievable. But Hitler was unyielding, his mind set on this desperate gamble. "This operation is our last chance," he declared, his voice filled with a chilling determination. "Either we break the Allies now, or we lose the war entirely." Preparations for the operation proceeded under a shroud of utmost secrecy. The code name, Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was deliberately chosen to create the impression that the Germans were preparing for a defensive posture, not a large-scale offensive. Troop movements took place only under the cover of darkness. All radio communication was strictly forbidden. Officers were forced to swear oaths of silence under the threat of execution for any breach of security. By December 15th, the Germans had managed to concentrate a massive force of 200,000 men, 600 tanks and assault guns, and 1,900 artillery pieces in the Ardennes. It was the largest concentration of German forces on the Western Front since the Allied landings in Normandy 6 months earlier. Facing this overwhelming force, the Americans had only 83,000 soldiers spread across 4 divisions. The U.S. command, as mentioned before, considered the Ardennes terrain too difficult and unsuitable for large-scale military operations. General Troy H. Middleton's A8 Corps held the sector with a combination of green, untested units and battered units recovering from previous engagements. German officer Lieutenant Colonel Freiherr von der Heide described the mood in the American trenches before the attack. The Yanks were playing cards, listening to jazz on the radio, and dreaming of Christmas back home. They had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. On December 16, 1944, at precisely 0530 hours, German artillery unleashed the heaviest barrage on the Western Front since D-Day. A staggering 1,900 guns simultaneously rained fire upon American positions along the entire 80-kilometer front. Private James McNamara of the 99th Infantry Division later recalled, "I'd been in the infantry for 2 years, but I had never seen such hell. The ground jumped under our feet. Trees fell like matchsticks. It felt like the world was ending. But the intense artillery preparation lasted for only 90 minutes. The Germans simply could not afford to expend more ammunition. They didn't have the reserves to sustain a longer bombardment. At 700 hours, the infantry assault began, supported by tanks and assault guns. The first and most devastating blows fell upon the 14th Cavalry Group and the 106th Infantry Division. These units were the least experienced in General Troy Middleton's 8 Corps. The 106th had only arrived at the front lines on December 11th and had not yet fully prepared their defensive positions. The German offensive followed the classic blitzkrieg pattern, a tactic they had perfected over the years. Tanks infiltrated weak spots in the American defense, while waves of infantry mopped up any strong points left behind. The heaviest blows came from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler on the northern flank, and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend in the center. By noon, the situation for the Americans had become critical, teetering on the brink of disaster. 2 regimental combat teams of the 106th Division, the 492nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, were completely encircled near the village of Schönberg. It was the largest American pocket since Bastogne in the Philippines in 1942. Colonel George Deschanel, commander of the 422nd, attempted to break out of the encirclement, but German tanks already controlled all the key roads and escape routes. At 1630 hours, he received a direct order from Division Command. "Hold your positions at all costs. Help is on the way." But no help ever arrived. General Allen Jones, the commander of the 106th, had lost contact with half of his units. His headquarters in St. Vith descended into complete chaos. Telephones rang incessantly. Couriers rushed in and out, carrying conflicting and often contradictory reports. The situation map became a confusing mosaic of red blotches, indicating areas under enemy control. Meanwhile, German panzer units continued to push deeper and deeper into the American defenses. The battle group, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, advanced a remarkable 25 kilometers and seized the village of Bullingen. It was here that the first major tragedy of the battle unfolded. An American column, consisting primarily of medics and service troops, ran headlong into Peiper's tanks near Malmedy. 84 American soldiers surrendered, only to be brutally executed in a field by Peiper's SS men. This horrific event, forever remembered as the Malmedy Massacre, became a chilling symbol of the brutality and ruthlessness of the Battle of the Bulge. By the end of the first day, the Germans had advanced a staggering 20 kilometers along the entire front. In American headquarters, confusion and uncertainty reigned supreme. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army, for the first time in the entire war, seemed to have lost control of the situation. December 17th was arguably the darkest day for American forces during the entire Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive continued to spread like an oil slick, engulfing more and more territory with each passing hour. By noon, It had become undeniably clear that this was not simply a local diversion or a limited probing attack, but a full-scale, all-out offensive aimed at achieving a decisive breakthrough. At St. Vith, a crucial transportation hub, the American defense was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. Major General Robert Hasbrouck, commander of the 7th Armored Division, received orders to immediately move his division to aid the encircled units of the 106th. However, his division was scattered along a 30-kilometer front, making a rapid concentration of forces virtually impossible. "I need at least 12 hours to concentrate my forces," Hasbrouck reported by radio, his voice filled with concern. "But I fear that in 12 hours, there will be no one left to save." Indeed, the situation for the 492nd and 423rd Regiments was rapidly deteriorating, spiraling towards hopelessness. Surrounded in the dense forests near Schönberg, the American soldiers were starving, freezing, and running critically low on ammunition. The Germans methodically tightened the noose around them, using artillery and mortars to inflict heavy casualties and further demoralize the trapped troops. Private Elmer Clark of the 423rd Regiment wrote in his diary, "Third day in encirclement. No food, no ammunition. We can't evacuate the wounded. The Germans are shouting at us to surrender, promising good treatment. The boys are starting to crack." On December 19th, the resistance of the 422nd and 423rd Regiments finally came to an end. Over 7,000 American soldiers surrendered, marking the largest single capitulation of U.S. forces in Europe during the entire war. German propagandists immediately seized upon this event, using it to boost the morale of their troops and to portray the Americans as weak and easily defeated. But not all American units succumbed to panic and despair. In the strategically important town of Bastogne, a vital road junction, the 101st Airborne Division was preparing for a desperate siege. These paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, had no intention of surrendering without putting up a fierce and determined fight. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the division, received a German ultimatum demanding their immediate surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. McAuliffe's now legendary reply, delivered with characteristic American bluntness, was simply, "Nuts." Meanwhile, German panzer divisions continued to press forward, seeking to exploit their initial successes. Piper's battle group reached the village of Stavelot, a mere 10 kilometers from a massive American fuel depot at Spa. Had the SS managed to capture this depot, they would have had more than enough fuel to reach the Meuse River and potentially achieve their strategic objectives. But here, the Germans encountered a potent combination of American ingenuity and unwavering resolve. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin's engineer company meticulously rigged every bridge on Piper's route with explosives. When the German tanks approached Stavelot, the Americans blew up the bridge over the Amblev River, effectively trapping Piper's battle group. Ahead, a destroyed bridge and a hail of American anti-tank fire. Behind them, other U.S. units were already launching counterattacks, seeking to cut off their retreat. Ammunition and fuel were running dangerously low. "We are in a position where every hour may be our last," Piper noted grimly in his war diary. "The Americans are proving to be much tougher opponents than we expected." By the end of the day, it was becoming increasingly clear that the German advance was losing momentum. The heroic resistance put up by isolated American garrisons, the destruction of key bridges, and the critical shortages of fuel were all contributing to slowing the German push. On December 19, 1944, at 10:30 a.m., the phone rang in the 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy. General George Patton, never one to shy away from a challenge, picked up the receiver, and heard the unmistakable voice of the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. "George," Eisenhower said, his tone serious and direct, "the situation in the Ardennes is critical. I need your army." Eisenhower succinctly explained the dire situation. The Germans had broken through American lines for 60 kilometers. 2 U.S. divisions had been effectively destroyed. Bastogne was completely surrounded and under siege. "How long will it take you to turn your army north?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency. 48 hours, Patton replied without a moment's hesitation. "Give me 48 hours and I'll attack." Eisenhower paused, clearly considering the immense scope of Patton's proposal. What Patton was suggesting seemed almost impossible, a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. The Third Army was currently deployed eastward, preparing to cross the Saar River into Germany. Now, it had to pivot a full 90 degrees and march 150 kilometers north in the dead of winter, on treacherous, icy roads. Any other general would have asked for at least a week to regroup, resupply, and prepare for such a massive undertaking. But Patton, ever confident and audacious, promised to deliver in just 48 hours. "All right, George," Eisenhower finally said, his voice betraying a hint of admiration. "Do it." Patton slammed down the receiver and turned to his staff, his eyes blazing with determination. His chief of staff, Major General Hobart Hap Gay, shook his head in disbelief as he looked at the map. "Boss," Gay protested, "it's impossible. We've got 133,000 men, 800 tanks, and 500 guns. How can we possibly move them all that distance in just 2 days?" Patton simply smiled, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "You haven't yet seen what a real army can do, Hap," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "You're about to." For the next 2 hours, the Third Army headquarters buzzed with a frenzy of activity. Planning officers frantically drew up routes for hundreds of columns of vehicles. Communications officers organized radio networks to ensure seamless communication between units. Supply officers calculated fuel and ammunition needs, scrambling to find ways to keep the army supplied during the massive redeployment. At 1 p.m., Patton gathered his division commanders, his voice ringing with authority. "Gentlemen," he declared, "we face the toughest operation of the entire war. We must turn this entire army north and strike the Germans in 48 hours. Who here thinks that this is impossible?" Not a single hand was raised. The commanders of the Third Army knew their commanding officer. They knew old blood and guts. They knew that when Patton made a promise, he kept it, no matter the odds. "Excellent," Patton continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "The 4th Armored Division moves to Arlon, the 26th Infantry to Luxembourg, the 80th Infantry to Mersch. The march begins today at 1800 hours. Any questions?" Major General Hugh Gaffey, commander of the 4th Armored, raised his hand. "Sir, what about supplies?" "We'll be cutting ourselves off from our existing supply bases. Supplies will come," Patton replied firmly, brooking no argument. "I've arranged it with the French. They're giving us access to all their depots. Plus, Army Air Corps will drop ammo from the air." At 1800 hours, Patton's Third Army began the fastest and most audacious redeployment in modern military history. Across the frozen roads of France and Luxembourg, hundreds of columns of tanks, guns, and trucks began to move. A seemingly endless stream of men and machines heading towards their destiny. 133,000 soldiers marched north toward the sound of the guns. The night of December 20th was a hellish ordeal for the soldiers of Patton's Third Army. Temperatures plummeted to 15 degrees Celsius, turning the roads into treacherous ice rinks. Hundreds of columns of vehicles moved in near-total darkness, guided only by blackout headlights, Sergeant Mike O'Connor of the 4th Armored Division later wrote to his wife, "We marched all night on frozen roads. Tanks skidded, trucks slid into ditches, but nobody stopped. Patton said 48 hours. So 48 hours it will be." The logistical challenges were simply staggering. The Third Army had over 15,000 vehicles, ranging from massive tanks to field kitchens. All of them had to be moved 150 kilometers without significantly reducing their combat effectiveness. Colonel Walter Mueller, the head of the Army's movement section, devised a meticulous plan to manage this complex operation. Roads were carefully divided into corridors. Armored divisions took the main highways, while infantry divisions used the secondary roads. Artillery and support units were relegated to the back roads. Each column had a precise schedule to follow. Tanks were to travel at 25 kilometers per hour on highways and 15 kilometers per hour on dirt roads. Truck-mounted infantry was to move at 30 kilometers per hour, while artillery on tractors was to proceed at 20 kilometers per hour. Stops were allowed only for refueling and essential maintenance. French gendarmes directed traffic at intersections, while American military police controlled the main routes. Engineer battalions worked tirelessly to clear snow and spread sand on particularly icy stretches of road. But the greatest challenge of all was concealment. German air reconnaissance must not discover the Third Army's massive redeployment. Therefore, all movement took place only at night, with columns of vehicles carefully hidden in forests and wooded areas during the day. On December 20th, at 1400 hours, the first units of the 4th Armored Division reached the area of Arlon, a mere 30 kilometers from the besieged town of Bastogne. It was an astoundingly fast redeployment, 150 kilometers in just 20 hours. Major General Gaffey immediately set up his command post and radioed Patton. "Sir, the vanguard is in place, ready for battle." "Excellent, Hugh," Patton replied, his voice crackling over the radio. "Now show those Germans what American speed really means." Meanwhile, the 26th Infantry Division, under the command of General Willard Paul, reached its designated positions near Luxembourg City. The 80th Infantry Division, commanded by General Horace McBride, assembled in the Mersch area. In just 36 hours, Patton had successfully moved 133,000 men and 15,000 vehicles, a feat that stands as the fastest strategic redeployment of an army in all of World War II. The German command had absolutely no idea that an entire American army was rapidly approaching from the south. But Patton had no intention of stopping to admire his own handiwork. On December 21st, at 0600 hours, he gave the order that would launch the counterattack. "We attack today. No artillery preparation, no probing attacks, just forward and tear their guts out." The Third Army prepared for the boldest counterattack in its storied history. On December 22, 1944, at 0600 hours, the eerie silence of the Ardennes morning was shattered by the thunderous roar of tank engines. Patton's 4th Armored Division of the Third Army launched a powerful counterattack from the south against the unsuspecting German positions. Major General Hugh Gaffey deployed his division in a classic armored formation, a testament to his experience and tactical acumen. Tank battalions led the way, followed closely by motorized infantry and half-tracks, with self-propelled artillery providing fire support from the flanks. A formidable force of 160 Sherman tanks and 80 self-propelled guns surged northward, eager to engage the enemy. The Germans were caught completely off guard, utterly unprepared for the fury that was about to be unleashed upon them. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, who only yesterday had arrogantly mocked the American shopkeepers, now frantically tried to shift his reserves to meet this unexpected and overwhelming new threat. Where did they get an entire army? He shouted over the radio to his chief of staff. his voice laced with panic. 3 days ago, they were running in panic, and now they're attacking with 3 divisions at once. The first major clash took place near the village of Martelange. The German 5th Parachute Regiment had dug in among the stone houses and prepared to repel what they expected to be a frontal assault. But the Americans attacked in a way that the Fallschirmjäger, the elite German paratroopers, did not anticipate. Instead of launching a head-on attack, the Sherman tanks split into small groups and encircled the village from 3 different directions simultaneously. Self-propelled M7 Priest howitzers fired direct rounds into the buildings, while infantry advanced under the cover of strategically placed smoke screens. Within just 2 hours, Martelange was liberated. German losses were heavy: 340 killed and wounded, and 180 captured. American losses, by comparison, were relatively light: 23 killed and 67 wounded. The casualty ratio spoke volumes about the effectiveness of the American counterattack, but the greatest impact was undoubtedly psychological. German soldiers, who only yesterday had felt like victors, suddenly realized that they were now the ones being attacked, and that the Americans were fighting with a ferocity and determination they had not previously witnessed. The speed and decisiveness of the American assault left the German troops feeling overwhelmed, their resistance seemingly futile. SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Schultz of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "The Americans attack like madmen. Their tanks are everywhere, in front, on the flanks, behind. It seems like they have endless reserves. We have only what remains after 5 days of constant assault." By noon, the 4th Armored Division had advanced 8 kilometers and reached the approaches to Bastogne. Here, the Americans encountered fierce resistance. The Germans had hastily rushed in the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the remnants of the 5th Parachute Division to defend the vital road junction. The fiercest battle of the entire counterattack was about to begin. German Panthers and Tigers, formidable fighting machines, clashed with American Shermans in open terrain. Technically, the German tanks were superior to the American Shermans in terms of firepower and armor. But the Americans had a significant advantage in numbers, and, even more importantly, in logistics. When a German tank was knocked out, its crew often had nowhere to retreat, and more often than not, the tank could not be replaced. When an American Sherman was lost, another one rolled forward to take its place within the hour. Thanks to Patton's relentless focus on maintaining a steady flow of supplies, Patton's seemingly inexhaustible supplies of fuel and ammunition seemed to defy all logic. Captain James Leach, a tank company commander, recalled, "We lost 12 tanks in 1 day, but by evening we received 15 replacements. The Germans lost 8 and got none. The arithmetic of war was clearly on our side." By the end of December 22nd, the German ring around Bastogne had been pierced from the south. The 4th Armored Division had established a narrow corridor to the besieged stronghold, providing a tenuous but vital link to the outside world. The 101st Airborne Division, which had held out against overwhelming odds, was finally saved. December 23rd brought a dramatic change in the weather that completely shifted the balance of power in favor of the Americans. The thick fog that had shrouded the battlefield for days finally lifted. The sky cleared, and American air power could finally enter the battle in full force. At 0830 hours, the first P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over the battlefield, their powerful engines roaring overhead. Each heavy fighter bomber carried 10 HVAR rockets and 500-pound bombs. German armored columns, which had previously moved with relative impunity, now stood out as easy targets against the snow-covered fields. Major Robert S. Johnson, an ace pilot of the 56th Fighter Group, led the first strike. We saw the perfect picture beneath us, he later recalled. German tanks and trucks stretched out along the road for kilometers. It was like a shooting gallery. On the first day of sustained air operations, the Germans lost a staggering 89 tanks and assault guns, plus over 200 other vehicles and tractors. It was a devastating blow from which the panzer divisions never fully recovered. But on the ground, the fighting only intensified. Encouraged by the success at Bastogne, Patton ordered the offensive to be expanded, seeking to exploit the Germans' weakened state. The 26th Infantry Division attacked towards Wiltz, while the 80th Infantry Division pushed on towards Edelbruck. The fiercest battle erupted for the town of Diekirch. This small Luxembourgish town became the key to the entire German position in the southern sector of the Bulge. Whoever held Diekirch controlled the main lines of communication for the German forces. The Germans desperately pulled in the 352nd Infantry Division and remnants of the 276th Infantry Division to defend the town. The defense was commanded by experienced Colonel Erich Schmidt, a veteran of the Eastern Front. "This town is the key to our southern flank," Schmidt told his men. "If the Americans take it, the entire 7th Army risks encirclement." The attack on Diekirch was led by Colonel Harry Flint of the 80th Infantry Division. His plan was simple but effective. Diversionary attacks from the west and east, with the main strike coming from the north, where the Germans least expected it. The battle began at 500 hours on December 24th. American 105mm howitzers shelled German positions for an hour, after which 3 infantry battalions advanced with tank support. The Germans resisted desperately. Every house became a fortress, every street a defensive line. The Americans fought house by house, room by room, in a brutal and unforgiving urban battle. Sergeant Frank Peterson of the 317th Infantry Regiment recalled, "It was like hell. The Germans sat in cellars with machine guns and Panzerfausts. Any room could be your last. But we kept pushing forward because we knew that Patton was behind us, urging us on. By the end of the day, the Americans held half of the town. The Germans fell back to the center of Diekirch and entrenched themselves in a 14th century stone church, using its thick walls and imposing height as a natural defensive position. From there, they continued to pour fire upon the advancing U.S. troops. Colonel Flint called for reinforcements, a battery of 105mm howitzers. 2 direct hits from these powerful guns reduced the ancient church to a pile of rubble, burying the remaining German defenders beneath the shattered stone. German resistance collapsed. On Christmas Day, December 25th, Diekirch was fully liberated. The southern flank of the German Bulge had begun to crumble. December 25th, 1944, entered history as the Christmas miracle of Patton's Third Army, the day when the tide of battle decisively turned in favor of the Americans. On the day when all of Christian Europe celebrated the birth of Christ, American soldiers received the best gift of all, the chance to win. At 600 hours, Patton personally arrived at the forward command post of the 4th Armored Division near Bastogne. He wanted to assess the situation for himself and plan the next phase of the counterattack. "Gentlemen," he told his commanders, a mischievous glint in his eyes, "the Germans have given us the best Christmas present we could have asked for. They poured out of their fortifications and let themselves be destroyed in the open field. Now it's our turn to hand out the gifts." The situation truly favored the Americans. In just 4 days of counterattacks, the Third Army had advanced 20 kilometers, liberated Bastogne, and captured several key towns and road junctions. Most importantly, the German initiative was gone for good. SS Obergruppenführer Dietrich, who only a week earlier had dreamed of a second Dunkirk, was now feverishly looking for ways to save his battered divisions from complete destruction. His 6th SS Panzer Army had lost half of its tanks and a third of its manpower, and its morale was plummeting. "The Americans no longer fight the way they used to," he reported to Hitler, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "They've become faster, bolder, and more ruthless. Patton has completely outplayed us all." Indeed, Patton's tactics were radically different from the traditional, cautious American approach to warfare. Instead of slow preparation and cautious advances, he had chosen speed and aggression. His tanks struck where the enemy least expected it, and his infantry never paused to consolidate their gains, always pressing forward, always keeping the enemy off balance. "Speed is everything," Patton constantly repeated to his commanders. "While the Germans are thinking, we're acting. While they're regrouping, we're attacking. They're playing at war. We're winning it." On December 26th, the Third Army launched a new stage of the offensive. The goal was no longer just to relieve Bastogne, but to encircle and annihilate the entire southern portion of the German Bulge. The 4th Armored Division struck northeast, aiming to cut the vital Bastogne-Houffalize road. The 26th Infantry Division advanced on Wiltz, while the 80th Infantry cleared the remaining German resistance in Luxembourg. The fiercest fighting erupted over the village of Cibray, which had been turned into a formidable strongpoint by the Germans. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had transformed every farmhouse into a bunker, every barn into a firing position, determined to hold their ground at all costs. But the Americans found an unorthodox solution. Instead of launching a costly frontal assault, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the aggressive and innovative commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, ordered his Shermans to attack at night, with their headlights on. "The Germans expect tanks to attack in daylight," Abrams explained to his surprised subordinates. "A night assault with headlights will stun them, disorient them, and give us the edge we need." The audacious gamble worked brilliantly. German anti-tank gunners, blinded by the intense glare of the tank headlights, were unable to aim accurately. The German infantry, caught completely off guard and terrified by the sudden appearance of the attacking tanks, panicked and abandoned their positions. Within a matter of hours, the American tanks had punched a gaping hole in the German defenses, opening the way for the infantry to exploit the breakthrough and overwhelm the remaining resistance. The village of Cibray fell to the Americans, and the German position in the southern Bulge began to unravel completely. 3 hours in, CBRE was taken. By the end of December, the German offensive in the Ardennes had become a complete failure. American and British forces were squeezing it from 3 sides. Artillery and aircraft cut off all routes of retreat. By December 27th, German headquarters was consumed by chaos and near panic. A week earlier, what had appeared to be a triumphant advance had turned into a complete disaster. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, called an emergency meeting at his headquarters in Civey. The reports from his division commanders painted a very bleak picture. Colonel Otto Skorzeny, commander of the 150th Panzer Brigade, reported, "My unit has lost 60% of its equipment. The Americans attack so fast, we can't even maneuver." Major General Siegfried Ruf of the 5th Parachute Division added, "My division is scattered. Regiments have no contact with each other. American artillery is firing constantly around the clock." Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzer Lehr Division said, "I have 18 tanks left out of 80. Fuel for 1 day, ammunition for half a day." Model listened to all of this with a stony expression. The brilliant tactician who had held back the Red Army for 2 years now stood powerless against the American onslaught. "The problem isn't that the Americans got better," he told his chief of staff. The problem is that we got worse. Our soldiers are exhausted, our equipment is worn out, and we have no reserves. The divisions participating in the offensive were pale imitations of the Wehrmacht's former glory. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend was manned by boys of only 16 and 17 years old. The 276th Infantry Division was filled with reservists who were 40 to 50 years old. Even the elite 1st SS Panzer Division was suffering from a shortage of experienced officers. Meanwhile, Patton was preparing the final blow. On December 28th, he summoned his corps commanders and unveiled Operation Thunderbolt. "Gentlemen," he said, "the Germans are stuck in the Ardennes like a fly in a web. It's time to shut the trap for good." The plan was both daring and risky. The Third Army would swing northwest and link up with Hodge's First Army advancing from the north. This would create a pocket, trapping 3 German armies. But to do that, they would have to cover another 40 kilometers through difficult terrain against desperate German defenses, all in the dead of winter with temperatures plummeting to minus 20 degrees Celsius. "Sir," said Major General Eddy, commander of 18 Corps, "what if the Germans manage to retreat?" Patton smiled and replied, "They won't. Hitler won't let them. He'll order them to hold to the last man, and that will be his last mistake." On December 29th, Operation Thunderbolt began. 3 corps of the Third Army struck northwest. The 4th Armored pushed toward Bastogne. The 6th Armored attacked Houffalize. The 11th Armored advanced on Houffalize. German resistance was desperate, but it was also disorganized. Their scattered divisions couldn't support one another. The Americans used their mobility, striking where the enemy was weakest. By the end of the day, the bulge had shrunk by another 15 kilometers. German losses were over 8,000 men and 150 tanks. American losses were 890 men and 23 tanks. On January 1st, 1945, Patton received an intelligence report that piqued his interest. The Germans had deployed a battalion of heavy tanks, 14 King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world. These 70-ton monsters, armed with an 88 mm gun, were practically invulnerable to standard American tanks. A single King Tiger could wipe out an entire company of Shermans without taking any damage. "Interesting," Patton said to his intelligence chief. "So the Germans want to test their toys against us. Let's see how that works out." On January 2nd, the King Tigers of the 501st SS Heavy Tank Battalion entered combat near the village of Poteau. Opposing them was the 8th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, 17 Shermans under Lieutenant Colonel Jenks Richardson. On paper, it looked like David versus Goliath. The Sherman weighed 32 tons and mounted a 76mm gun, effective against a King Tiger only at less than 500 meters. The King Tiger could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters. But Richardson was a veteran of the North African campaign. He knew that in tank battles, the winner wasn't always the one with the better tank, but the one with the better tactics. "Listen carefully," he told his crews over the radio. "We won't fight them head on. We'll hunt them like wolves in a pack, fast and unexpected." Richardson split his battalion into 4 groups of 4 tanks each. One group would draw German fire with a frontal demonstration. The 2nd and 3rd would attack from the flanks. The 4th would strike from the rear. The battle began at 2:30 p.m. The German Tigers, positioned on a hill, methodically destroyed American tanks. In 5 minutes, they knocked out 3 Shermans without taking any losses themselves. But then the American tactic worked. While the Germans were focused on the frontal group, the flanking groups attacked their weaker side armor. The side armor was much less resistant than the thick frontal plate. The result stunned even the Americans. In 40 minutes, They destroyed 8 King Tigers while losing only 6 Shermans. The cost ratio was staggering. 1 King Tiger was worth 5 Shermans. More importantly, it was a crushing psychological blow. The Germans' most powerful weapon was not invincible after all. The Americans proved that even technical superiority doesn't save you if the enemy outthinks you. SS Obersturmführer Johann Pohl, commander of the 501st Battalion, radioed, "The Americans fight completely differently now. They are smarter, faster, and bolder. Our Tigers were beaten not by machines, but by tactics." On January 3rd, Patton personally inspected the wreckage. Walking among the smoldering hulks of King Tigers, he uttered a phrase that became famous. "It doesn't matter how big and powerful your tank is. What matters is who sits inside." On January 8, 1945, Hitler finally made the hardest decision of his military career. He authorized a retreat from the Ardennes. 22 days of bloody fighting had demonstrated that Germany's last gamble had failed. But the German retreat was no less dramatic than the offensive. Under constant attack by American aircraft and artillery, trudging along icy roads, abandoning equipment and severely wounded men, 3 German armies struggled back toward the Siegfried Line. Patton had no intention of letting the Germans withdraw peacefully. "They came as uninvited guests," he said. "Now let them pay for it." On January 9th and 10th, the Third Army struck at the retreating German columns. American aircraft operated day and night, turning the German marches into bloody nightmares. Major Gerhard Engel of the 12th SS Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "This isn't a retreat. It's a rout. Wrecked vehicles everywhere. Bodies everywhere. American planes hunt us like rabbits. Discipline is collapsing." On January 16th, the spearheads of the U.S. 3rd and 1st Armies met near Houffalize. The Bulge was eliminated. The Battle of the Bulge ended in a complete Allied victory. The results were catastrophic for Germany. The Wehrmacht lost 67,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, 700 tanks and assault guns, and 1,600 aircraft. These had been the Reich's last strategic reserves. American losses were 19,000 men and 733 tanks. But unlike the Germans, the U.S. could replace such losses in a matter of weeks. Field Marshal Rundstedt, assessing the outcome of the battle, uttered a phrase that became the epitaph of the Third Reich. "After the Ardennes, we have no resources left for strategic operations. From now on, we can only retreat and await the end." But the worst blow for Germany was not material, but moral. Their final attempt to change the course of the war had collapsed in utter failure. Wehrmacht soldiers who, in December, still believed in a possible victory, now knew the war was lost for good. Patton, by contrast, was at the peak of his glory. In 26 days of fighting, his Third Army had marched 150 kilometers, destroyed 4 German divisions, and liberated dozens of towns. On January 16th, Eisenhower personally visited the Third Army headquarters to congratulate Patton. "George," he said, "what you did in the Ardennes will go down in history as one of the greatest feats of the U.S. Armed Forces." When the Battle of the Bulge ended, it was time to take stock and analyze the mistakes that had been made. Why did Germany's last gamble fail so catastrophically? Why were armies that had once triumphed on every front now powerless against the Americans? The chief error of the German command was underestimating the enemy. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to victories from 1939 through 1942, failed to realize that the U.S. Army of 1944 was fundamentally different from the inexperienced troops of 1942 and 1943. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief intelligence officer, conducted a detailed analysis of German planning for Operation Wacht am Rhein. His conclusions were striking. The Germans planned this operation using the logic of 1940. They expected the Americans to panic and retreat like the French had 4 years earlier. But the Americans of 1944 were entirely different soldiers. Indeed, in 2.5 years of war, the U.S. Army had developed enormously. Officers had gained experience in Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Soldiers had learned to fight as well as the Germans. American technology and logistics had reached unmatched levels of efficiency. The Germans also underestimated the nature of the Americans themselves. Unlike Europeans, who were long accustomed to rigid hierarchies, Americans were used to initiative and independence. When a commander was killed, a sergeant took command. When the sergeant fell, a private stepped up. This trait proved decisive in the chaos of the Ardennes. German soldiers cut off from their command often lost the will to fight. Americans in the same situation only fought harder. American technological superiority also played a crucial role. By 1944, U.S. industry was at its peak. A lost tank could be replaced within hours, a downed plane within a day, a fallen pilot within a week. The Germans, in contrast, were fighting at the limits of their resources. Each Tiger tank lost was irreplaceable. Each Me-262 shot down was a catastrophe. Experienced pilots and tank crews were worth their weight in gold. But Hitler's greatest mistake was his strategic delusion. He planned the Ardennes offensive as a turning point that would force the Western Allies into a separate peace with Germany. This was pure illusion. By the end of 1944, the Allies already saw the end of the war approaching and were preparing for post-war settlements. No tactical setback could persuade them to compromise with the Nazi regime. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, put it bluntly. Hitler lived in a world of illusions. He thought we were like the French in 1940. But we didn't come for glory or territory. We came to destroy Nazism forever. The Germans also miscalculated the psychological factor. The Malmedy massacre, where SS troops executed American prisoners, only hardened Allied resolve. Instead of fear and hesitation, it gave the Americans new motivation to fight to the finish. Sergeant Kurt Vonnegut of the 423rd Infantry Regiment wrote in his diary, "When we heard about Malmedy, the mood in the companies changed overnight. Before, we saw the Germans as ordinary soldiers following orders. Now we saw them as murderers who had to be destroyed." Operation Wacht am Rhein revealed another fatal weakness of German strategy: total dependence on the Führer himself. Hitler personally planned the operation, personally appointed commanders, and personally forbade retreat. Even when situations became hopeless, a system built on the cult of one man proved fatally fragile. When the Führer's decisions were wrong, they could not be corrected. No one dared to oppose the greatest commander of all time. The American command system, in contrast, rested on collegiality and professionalism. Eisenhower consulted his subordinates. Patton listened to his staff. Division commanders had freedom of initiative. The result was inevitable. A flexible American system defeated a rigid German hierarchy. To fully grasp the scale of the American victory in the Ardennes, it's worth analyzing in detail what Patton achieved with his Third Army. Military historians regard this operation as one of the greatest examples of operational art in the 20th century. First, Patton demonstrated unmatched speed of reaction. From Eisenhower's phone call to the launch of the counterattack, only 72 hours passed. In that time, the Third Army pivoted its entire front by 90 degrees and marched 150 kilometers. For comparison, The Germans needed at least a week to redeploy a single army, and the Soviets about 10 days. Patton did it in 3. The secret lay in an extraordinary logistical organization. Colonel Walter Miller, chief of movement for the Third Army, designed a system that allowed massive troop movements with minimal traffic jams or delays. Each division had a detailed march route timed to the minute. Each column knew where and when to refuel. Every commander had clear contingency instructions. "Logistics is the art of the possible," Miller said. And we made the impossible possible. Second, Patton showed mastery in the tactical use of different arms. His armored divisions acted not as blunt iron fists, but as surgical scalpels, slicing through German defenses at their weakest points. Instead of frontal assaults, Patton used flanking maneuvers. Instead of long artillery barrages, he relied on sudden strikes supported by attack aircraft. Instead of cautious advances, he launched rapid breakthroughs with immediate exploitation. "Patton fought outside the rules," said Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division. "When we expected him to strike from the front, he hit from the flank. When we prepared for a flank attack, he struck from the rear." Third, Patton displayed a unique ability to exert psychological pressure on the enemy. His Third Army didn't just advance, it created an atmosphere of inevitable German defeat. Fast breakthroughs, sweeping flanks, sudden blows to the rear all eroded German confidence. Many units surrendered before firing a shot. "Patton didn't just fight our soldiers," Field Marshal Model later wrote in his memoirs. "He fought our spirit, and in that fight, we lost." Fourth, the American general showed a rare talent for coordinating multiple armies. The Ardennes counterattack required close cooperation between Patton's Third Army, Hodge's First Army, and Simpson's Ninth Army. Patton didn't merely execute his assigned role. He actively shaped the actions of neighboring forces. His initiative spurred other commanders to act, creating an avalanche effect. Patton wasn't just an army commander, Eisenhower assessed. He was a catalyst that accelerated everything around him. Finally, Patton revealed an uncommon instinct for seizing the initiative in the harshest conditions. When the Germans attacked in the Ardennes, most American commanders thought of defense. Patton immediately began planning a counterattack. This mindset, always seeking opportunities to strike, made Patton a unique military leader. He didn't react to the enemy's moves, he forced the enemy to react to his. The Battle of the Bulge ended nearly 80 years ago, yet its lessons remain relevant today. The operation stands both as a textbook on how not to plan strategic offensives and as a model for how to respond to a crisis. Lesson 1. Underestimating the enemy always leads to disaster. German planners based Operation Wacht am Rhein on outdated views of the U.S. Army, ignoring how much it had changed in 2 years of war. Modern conflicts prove this lesson still holds true. Armies that fail to adapt to new realities are doomed, no matter their past victories. Lesson 2. Speed of reaction in a crisis often matters more than perfect planning. Patton lacked time for meticulous preparation, but he had decisiveness and improvisation. In today's even faster wars, battlefield conditions can change in hours. Commanders who waste time on bureaucracy will lose to those who act quickly and boldly. Lesson 3. The psychological factor is as vital as material strength. The Germans had enough force for success in the Ardennes, but after their first setbacks, they lost faith. The Americans, even in their darkest hour, kept their confidence. That resilience let them withstand the blow and seize the initiative. Lesson 4. A flexible command system is essential. Germany's rigid hierarchy, with Hitler making every decision, failed in a dynamic situation. The American system, built on delegated authority and initiative, let commanders adapt quickly. Lesson 5. Logistics is critical. The German offensive collapsed largely due to a lack of fuel and ammunition. The Americans, by contrast, had virtually unlimited supplies. In modern conflicts, supply chains are even more complex. An army that can't sustain itself will lose regardless of its soldiers' heroism. Lesson 6. Technological superiority matters. By 1944, the U.S. held a significant advantage, not only in weapon quality but also in mass production and effective use. Lesson 7. Strategic maturity of leadership is decisive. The Americans saw the war as more than just battles. It was about destroying Nazi ideology. This vision allowed them to maintain coalition unity even in crisis and fight through to victory. The Ardennes was Germany's last great attempt to alter the war's course. Its failure meant that the fate of the Third Reich was sealed. The road to Berlin lay open. When the last fighting in the Ardennes ended in January 1945, it was clear that the world had changed forever. The operation that was supposed to bring Germany a second Dunkirk had become its final disaster. The irony was that the German mockery of the Americans became the catalyst for their own defeat. Contempt for the enemy, belief in their own superiority, dismissal of American capabilities, all this led to strategic blindness. On December 16, 1944, SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich had real reason for optimism. His divisions had broken through American defenses. Thousands of enemy soldiers had surrendered, and the road to Antwerp seemed open. But by December 22nd, that same Dietrich was desperately trying to save what remained of his army. Thus, the American merchants had proven to be such formidable warriors that even elite SS units could not withstand them. What had happened in those 6 days? How did an army retreating in panic seize the initiative and strike a devastating counterblow? The answer is that the Germans fought against outdated perceptions, not reality. Their image of the U.S. Army was 2 years out of date. In that time, the Americans had gone from raw novices to professional soldiers. More importantly, the Americans proved a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Victory goes not to those with the proudest traditions, but to those who adapt fastest to new conditions. The German army, burdened with immense historical experience, proved too conservative. The American army, free of dogma and stereotypes, developed new approaches to combat. Patton became the symbol of this new American philosophy of war. His Third Army fought not by academy cannon, but by the logic of effectiveness. The goal was results, not adherence to tradition. "I'm not fighting German generals," Patton said. "I'm fighting German soldiers, and my soldiers are better than theirs." This philosophy proved victorious. In 3 weeks of fighting in the Ardennes, the Americans not only repelled the German offensive, they showcased a new model of warfare that became the standard for future conflicts. Speed, flexibility, technological superiority, mastery of logistics, and psychological impact on the enemy. All these elements were united for the first time in one system in the Ardennes. The Germans, by contrast, revealed the danger of clinging to past glories. Blitzkrieg, so effective in 1939 and 1941, failed against an enemy that had learned how to counter it. Operation Wacht am Rhein became the swan song of the old European school of war. After the Ardennes, it was clear that the future belonged to those who changed quickly and dared to experiment. The American victory in the Ardennes had immense symbolic weight. It proved to the world that the United States was not only an industrial giant, but also a great military power. The European balance of power was changed forever. The era when Europe's armies decided the continent's fate had ended. The American era had begun, and it continues still. The Battle of the Bulge ended nearly 8 decades ago. Yet its echoes still resonate. It was not merely a military victory, but a symbol of an epochal shift. The transition from the old world to the new. On the morning of December 16, 1944, when German guns thundered through the Ardennes forest, few could have foreseen that this operation would be Europe's last bid to maintain its dominance. Germany, the heir to centuries of military tradition, wagered everything it had left. Facing it stood the young American army, a force from a country that only 40 years earlier had been fighting Native American tribes, but now laid claim to global leadership. The result shocked everyone, including the Americans themselves. In 26 days of combat, it became clear. The future belonged not to those with the longest history, but to those who learned and adapted fastest. Patton and his soldiers revealed a new understanding of war. For them, war was not an art, but a technology. Not a ritual, but a process. Not a display of national spirit, but a means to achieve concrete goals. This pragmatic philosophy proved stronger than romantic visions of glory. The Americans fought not to prove their superiority, but to finish the war quickly and go home. Paradoxically, that unpoetic motivation made them unstoppable. While the Germans dreamed of grand victories, the Americans methodically dismantled the German war machine, piece by piece. The German jokes about American merchants turned out to be prophetic in an unexpected way. The Americans did approach war like merchants, with calculation, planning, attention to detail, and a drive for maximum efficiency. The result speaks for itself. The merchants crushed the warriors. Technology beat tradition. The future outplayed the past. The Battle of the Bulge became a moment of truth for Western civilization. It showed leadership passing from the old world to the new, from Europe to America, from aristocracy to democracy. This transition was inevitable. But in the Ardennes, it found dramatic completion. When the last German tanks rolled back toward the Siegfried Line, an entire era rolled back with them. A new era had begun. The American era, the age when world politics was shaped by a nation whose soldiers, only yesterday, seemed to Europeans like untested amateurs. The irony was that the Germans themselves hastened the process. Their Operation Wacht am Rhein was meant to restore German leadership in Europe. Instead, it handed that leadership to America forever. Looking back at those dramatic days of winter, 1944 to 45, one sees that the Ardennes determined not just the outcome of World War II, but the shape of the century that followed. Patton and his men did more than defeat the German army. They unveiled a new way of thinking, a new culture of warfare, a new method of solving global problems. That legacy endures today. Modern conflicts still echo the principles first applied by the Americans in the Ardennes. Speed, technological edge, logistical precision, psychological impact. The Battle of the Bulge changed the face of war forever. And that is its enduring lesson. Was this lesson good for humanity? History has yet to answer. But one thing is beyond doubt. In December 1944, in the Ardennes forests, a new world was born, a world we still live in today.